will always endorse civility. Issues either pro or con, but in this committee room, we want to do that in a civilized way. I know you all agree and will cooperate. Let me say a few words about the direction of the hearing. It probably will last about 2.5 hours. There will be 4 panels for discussion. First, the Legislative Analyst's Office will address the cost and savings to the state, and the Board of Equalization will assess both the sales and excise tax revenues that could be generated if marijuana were legalized and regulated. The second panel will address the constitutional issues any state action to legalize marijuana would likely face. Third, there will be a discussion about the effect legalized marijuana might have on the criminal justice system. And the final panel, before we open things up for public comment, will examine what role the legalization of marijuana plays in crafting an effective and humane policy. So setting up those housekeeping rules, I want to introduce our first panel, and that is the fiscal evaluation of marijuana and legalization and regulation. And our first speakers are Paul Golowowski and Paul Warren from the Legislative Analyst's Office. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Paul Golowowski with the Legislative Analyst's Office. The committee asked us to speak today about the fiscal impact of legalizing marijuana. We prepared a handout for the committee that the sergeant should be distributing to you right now. It's also contained in this packet that committee staff put together at the beginning as well. First, I'll briefly talk about some of the current marijuana laws and regulations. I know that'll be discussed in more detail later, but since it impacts the fiscal evaluation to some extent, I'll go over it briefly. Under federal law, marijuana is generally illegal under the Federal Controlled Substances Abuse Act. Federal laws, as you probably know, are enforced by federal law enforcement agencies, but these agencies also act in many times in conjunction with state and local law enforcement agencies. Under state law, marijuana is also generally illegal, the possession, use, transportation, cultivation, etc. Penalties for marijuana-related activities vary quite a bit depending on the offense. For example, possession of less than 1 ounce of marijuana is a misdemeanor offense, punishable with a $100 fine, whereas cultivation of marijuana is a felony offense and as such can result in a prison sanction. There is one big exception to these laws, though, which is Proposition 215. Proposition 215 was passed by the voters in November 1996, and it legalized the cultivation and possession of marijuana for medicinal purposes. So patients, if they have a recommendation from a physician as well as their caregivers, can legally grow and possess marijuana for medicinal purposes. Now, obviously, Proposition 215 set up somewhat of a conflict between state and federal law. However, the U.S. Supreme Court did rule definitively in 2005 that federal authorities could continue to prosecute marijuana patients, medical marijuana patients and providers in California under federal laws. And for most of the time since 1996, when Prop 215 passed, the federal government did enforce its own laws in California prohibiting marijuana. However, just recently, in March 2009, the U.S. Department of Justice announced that it would change its policy and it would no longer prosecute marijuana patients and providers whose actions are consistent with state law. And the Department of Justice formalized this policy just in the past couple of weeks with a memorandum that it sent to its attorneys. As you're probably aware as well, there have been several proposed initiatives in recent months filed with the Attorney General that would broadly legalize marijuana beyond medicinal purposes, and the fiscal impacts that I'll discuss are based on our analysis of these initiatives, although I was speaking more generally about legalizing marijuana, not with regard to one particular initiative. So if you turn to page 2 of the handout, there's sort of one big caveat when we're looking at what would happen if California legalized marijuana, and that is we don't really know how the federal government would respond. As I mentioned earlier, the federal government has the authority to enforce its own marijuana laws in California, regardless of state law, and it did that for most of the time after Prop 215 passed, although recently there's been a change in policy. To the extent that the federal government continued to enforce its own marijuana laws in California, it would probably have the effect of impeding the use, transportation, cultivation, or sale in California simply because there would be federal enforcement here. So that creates a great deal of uncertainty when we're talking about the possible revenues and expenditures from legalizing marijuana that it's important to recognize up front. If you turn to page 3 of the handout, I'll discuss the state and local criminal justice expenditures and savings related to legalizing marijuana. If California were to legalize marijuana, the most obvious effect would be there would no longer be offenders in state prison on marijuana offenses or on parole for marijuana offenses. There would no longer be offenders in county jails for marijuana offenses or on probation for marijuana offenses. And so we estimate the savings from that at somewhere in the range of several tens of millions of dollars each year is the amount that state and local governments are currently spending to incarcerate marijuana offenders and supervise them in the community. One caveat to this is that the county jails right now are, many of them, about half of them, are under population caps, and they are releasing offenders early. So even if the population declined a little bit because there were no longer marijuana offenders coming into jail, that bed space would probably be used for other offenders who are being released early. So counties may not actually realize much of a cost savings. The next impact would be on court and local law enforcement. Legalizing marijuana obviously would result in a substantial reduction in the number of arrests that law enforcement currently makes, and as well as the number of criminal court cases. It's difficult to estimate precisely the amount which would be saved from this. And again, we know that law enforcement right now is prioritizing their resources, and to the extent that they no longer have to arrest people for marijuana, it might free up those resources to be used elsewhere. So again, there may not be much of a cost savings there if they just shift their resources to pursuing other activities that right now they're limited and they can't do. And the last effect on the criminal justice system would be with regard to fine revenues that are currently collected for marijuana penalties. As I mentioned earlier, misdemeanor possession of marijuana is a $100 base fine. There are other penalties in statute for marijuana activities, and to the extent it's legalized, state and local governments would no longer collect this fine revenue. The next page of the handout, page 4, discusses some of the effects on state and local health programs. First, I'll talk about the substance abuse programs. Right now there's not sort of good enough data or studies to say for sure whether or not legalizing marijuana would lead to an increase in consumption of marijuana. And even if it led to an increase in consumption of marijuana, we don't know if that would mean that more people are using marijuana casually, maybe just a couple of times a month, or if it would lead to an increase in the number of people who would become heavy users and might require substance abuse treatment. So there's not really good data to establish that link. But it is possible that if marijuana were legalized and it did increase consumption, and it did increase consumption by create a new category of heavy users that required substance abuse treatment, that could increase costs for the state, particularly through the state's drug Medi-Cal program. It's an entitlement program. So if you were eligible for drug Medi-Cal and marijuana were legalized and you started using it and you had a problem, then you would be eligible for this particular program. The state's other substance abuse programs are not entitlement programs, so they would not necessarily increase costs there. The other effect that it would have would be on state and locally funded drug treatment programs. For example, Prop 36 diverts certain offenders. If you're eligible for Prop 36, instead of going to prison or jail, you go to treatment. So it might free up space in that program, which could be used for other offenders since the resources are limited right now again. And another effect that it would have would be on the medical marijuana program, which was established in 2003 by the legislature, which set up a patient registry for medical marijuana patients so that they could have an ID card. And because marijuana would be legal, it's likely some people would no longer participate in the medical marijuana program. However, the program is supported entirely by fee revenue, so you'd sort of reduce both the fee revenue and the cost of the program. On the last page of the handout, we talk about some of the potential new revenues from legalizing marijuana. Again, there's a couple of caveats, as I mentioned before. We don't know how the federal government would continue to enforce its own marijuana laws. We also, there's not a lot of good data on the current price of marijuana, what would happen to the price if it were legalized. There's not good data on current consumption of marijuana or what would happen to consumption if marijuana were legalized. So there's quite a few caveats there. But basically, in our analysis, we found that state and local governments could potentially realize first new excise tax revenues. And just for an example, we estimate that an excise tax of $50 per ounce on marijuana could potentially generate a couple $100 million annually. In addition to that, the state and local governments could also realize new sales tax revenue. The state actually currently collects sales tax revenue on medical marijuana sales, and if marijuana were produced commercially beyond just for medicinal uses, it would increase sales tax revenue. And finally, the state could realize additional income tax revenue to the extent that legalizing marijuana led to a new industry and created new jobs in that nature. It would lead to increased income taxes. And that concludes my testimony, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you very much. And I do have some clarifying questions and also some points. One of the things I wanted to ask you was that in terms of incarceration, do you have a ballpark about how many people are incarcerated for possession and sale of, or cultivation or manufacturing of marijuana?
Yes, so currently there are about 1,500 individuals in state prison on marijuana offenses, and the breakdown of that is about 850 are in state prison under marijuana possession for sale, about 470 for sale of marijuana, and about 120 for other marijuana offenses, which would mostly be cultivation.
What's the current cost of incarceration for an inmate?
So it costs the state on our, there's two different costs that we use for state prisons. One, which you've probably heard, is the about $50,000 per inmate per year. That's sort of the full average cost. But when we're talking about incremental changes in the inmate population, smaller numbers such as this, we use a marginal cost number, which is about $23,000 a year. And that's just because the prisons are overcrowded right now. So each person that you're adding or subtracting isn't really necessarily resulting in the full cost. So it's about $23,000 a year for each of those inmates.
Then on page 4 of your handout, you posit that legalized marijuana will have a fiscal effect on publicly funded substance abuse treatment programs, including drug court. Well, doesn't it make sense that there would be a cost savings to drug court since there would be no pending criminal charges?
Yeah, the only point that we were making is that right now the amount of resources for drug courts or Prop 36 programs is limited. So if marijuana offenders were not sort of in drug courts or in Prop 36, it would free up that money to be spent on other offenders.
And then in terms of, you know, if there were a state tax or fee on marijuana sales, do you feel there'd be an impact on the overall state budget, and would that serve to offset some of our budget pressures?
Yeah, correct. As I mentioned, you know, we are estimating that there would be, you know, it would depend on the tax rate that was set, if there was an excise tax and stuff, but you know, conceivably there could be several hundreds of millions of dollars which would outweigh any of the probable increase of costs for substance abuse treatment.
And then on the medical marijuana front, how did federal prosecution affect the fiscal implications of 215? And could we draw a comparison?
Well, the federal government continued to prosecute, although marijuana, medical marijuana dispensaries did continue to operate. Now, probably there would have been more of them if the federal government had not been enforcing their laws during that period. And we don't know how aggressively the federal government would enforce their laws. I think with medical marijuana, while they did take a fairly hard stance, they could have taken an even harder stance. And we don't really know if it were legalized
And a
broadly.
different administration, so.
And a different administration.
But if counties were able to incarcerate more appropriate criminals, wouldn't that reduce the pretrial release or post-correction release? Wouldn't that also have some savings?
From the county?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And I was thinking about the medical marijuana. If anything, if we did legalize it, as you refer to, counties would not have to spend